And Tanya is with Travis County Constable Precinct 5, and I'm going to let you introduce yourself, and Chief Bobby Gutierrez.
Good morning.
Good morning. Hello, everyone. My name is Tanya Winters. I'm the volunteer coordinator for Travis County Constable Precinct 5 Accessible Parking Enforcement Program. And I have with me my chief, Bobby Gutierrez.
Good morning. My name is Bobby Gutierrez. I'm a Chief Deputy for Constable Carlos Lopez of Travis County Precinct 5.
Okay.
Let me know when you want me to change the slide.
So let's go ahead and change the slide. Okay, so today's objectives are going to be for you to understand more about accessible parking laws and regulations. We hope that you appreciate the importance of accessible parking for people with disabilities more, and that you learn more about volunteer enforcement programs. First off, just to talk a little bit about disabilities, you know, I always like to say to people, it's not if you have a disability, it's when. So when we talk about accessible parking, you know, we're talking about the fact that everyone will essentially need accessible parking at some point in their lives, and that's why it's important to learn about accessible parking, learn about disability, and respect disability and accessible parking. So if we can switch the screen. So what's the big deal about accessible parking? I have a couple of stats up here. 1 in 4 of today's 20-year-olds will have a disability before they retire. And then by the year 2030, 71.5 million baby boomers over the age of 65 will need access to products and services that will address their age-related physical changes. So again, everyone is going to need accessibility at some point, and that's why we need to start planning our communities and really teaching people about disability awareness, because we will all be there at one point in our lives. So can a disability happen to you? Of course it can. And so I have up here, if you click on that link, Randy.
Okay.
It actually something that I found through the Social Security website. Oh, and if you go down on the screen, keep going.
We lost our card.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
It's just, if you click on calculate my PDQ,
Okay.
that's your personal disability quotient. So if you scroll down a little bit there on the screen there, Randy. So you can fill out this questionnaire essentially, and it will give you your probability of getting a disability. And so I don't know if we want to go through this at this point, but I just think it's really important to note that everyone will have a disability at some point.
And we will send this information out after the session.
For sure. Okay, so if we go to the next screen. Okay, so the importance of accessible parking in the law, if we go to the next screen. So I'm going to shift over now to Chief Gutierrez, where he can kind of talk about the law.
From the law enforcement perspective, we use Texas Transportation Code Chapter 681, which covers all the privileged parking regulations and enforcement thereof. But to give a little historical perspective, in 1995, Constable 5 met with the disability community and legislature, and we got House Bill 2083 passed to take effect September 1st of 2095. That had to do with a lack of enforcement of the disability parking laws. And with that bill, it established a law enforcement agency to have a volunteer enforcement program. So the law enforcement agency can appoint trained volunteers to help enforce the disability parking statutes. In 1996, Travis County Commissioners Court authorized Constable 5 to establish what we believe to be the first disabled volunteer parking program in Travis County. And we partnered with the Texas Workforce Commission, and we hired a gentleman by the name of Clarence Holt, who happened to be disabled himself. And we had the very first voice-activated computer. He did it, actually, and he did an outstanding job and helped us engage the community and learn more about the needs of the disabled and how we can do a better job of enforcing and educating the community in the process. So we met with the courts and the prosecutors, and we developed a program that that empowered the volunteers to, and they don't have to be disabled, of course, but most of them that are engaged in this certainly are, but these trained volunteers, we provide a 4-hour training program, a minimum of, and they write a citation just like a police officer would for that enforcement, for that infraction. They submit it to our office, which our office then prepares 2 documents to the court, one of which is a probable cause affidavit and the other one is a complaint. That is required for any criminal offense to be filed with the courts in the state of Texas. So we also needed some additional evidence. So they were asked and continue to practice to this day having photographic evidence. So they take 3 photographs from 3 different angles to show that met the elements of the offense. And the elements of the offense, as the transportation code allows, is that it has to be posted with signage, not just markings on the pavement, but actual signage that show it is a reserved disabled spot. The other thing is that the offender should be displaying or not be displaying a placard, either a red, which is a temporary, or a blue, which is a permanent placard, or have disability registration. If they do not have a placard or disability registration, then they have committed an offense of parking where prohibited. And these individuals, as well as peace officers, can issue a citation for that offense. Our office leaves a copy of the citation just like any other entity would for parking violations, and we leave it on the vehicle. Those citations are then sent to our office. We prepare the documents for the volunteer to sign and affirm that they witnessed this violation, and they go to court and testify that this violation happened in their presence and view, just like any peace officer would. So we started that in 1996. We have 25 volunteers recruited at that time. We initiated the training. In 2005, the Travis County Commissioners Court approved full-time funding for 1 deputy whose sole focus was to do disability enforcement, and we still practice that to this day. In 2009, Constable 5's office partnered with several disability organizations, including ADAPT of Texas, CTD, Disability Rights of Texas, and we passed House Bill 3095. And 3095 increased the fines for violations to $500 and establishes a fee scale for multiple offenses, including repeat offenses. In 2013, Constable Lopez took office. He was the chief deputy when the DPE program was started in Travis County, so he certainly had a passion to continue it forward and has to this day. He's committed to this program. And we've expanded the program to include more volunteers, more community engagement, including some education and awareness promotional materials. We also do disability parking enforcement stings during times where there's increased activity in major public areas and shopping centers, where, for example, like Black Friday or tax-free weekend, where there's a lot more people out and they take advantage of disabled parking opportunities. So we certainly increase our efforts and have our volunteers increase their efforts with our law enforcement to enforce those particular issues. We have a very stringent background check for volunteers. The statute requires that an individual not have any felony convictions, which we certainly agree with, but our program is a little bit more stringent. The background check we have is that they not have any misdemeanor or felony convictions. The misdemeanor convictions above a Class B. So in other words, if an individual gets a Class C violation, which is like a traffic ticket or a parking citation, that's a Class C violation. And, you know, that's okay if they have that in their history, but a Class B or A, we won't consider them for our program. We have a total of 95 volunteers at this point, but we are not involved with the prosecution or the adjudication. We simply, as a law enforcement entity, we simply file the charges and let the adjudication take its course. That's kind of a summary of what we do.
Next slide. If we can do the next slide there.
Sorry about that.
It's okay. So I'm just going to go over briefly kind of what Chief touched on. So accessible parking offenses. The first one is parking without accessible plates or placards. The second one is blocking an access aisle or striped area next to an accessible parking space, a curb cut, or a ramp. And I have some examples of that a little bit later in the PowerPoint. So another violation is essentially misusing a placard or displaying plates or placards that essentially do not belong to either the driver and or the passenger in the vehicle. So in order to display an accessible parking placard, you need to be either you yourself as the driver needs to have a disability, or you need to be transporting somebody with a disability. Another violation is displaying an expired placard. Another violation is actually misusing a placard, illegally using a placard, and or altering a placard, and I do have an example of that a little bit later as well. So that just kind of briefly goes through what the violations are there.
If I could interject real quick here. The statute allows for trained volunteers to issue citations, and we certainly promote that. However, the volunteers are not authorized to question an individual. So violations that are related to abusing the use of the placard, either by a fictitious altering or using them inappropriately, the only way to ascertain that particular violation is to question the driver of the vehicle. So law enforcement are the only ones that actually can ID an individual and question them about that. Volunteers are not permitted by law to engage them in this capacity.
So essentially, a volunteer can issue a citation for parking without a placard, blocking an access aisle, or displaying an expired placard. Next slide. Okay, so we see the offenses here. Our first offense begins at 500. That's thanks to the HB 3095 legislation, and then you can see it goes up from there. So if we can go to the next slide. Okay, so what does a violation look like? Oh, you need to go back to that slide.
Sorry.
And now if you click on that, click actually on it, click twice. Okay, so we can see it scroll. Okay, so this is the first violation here. Keep scrolling. Okay, and we see this truck again, and keep scrolling, scrolling. Okay. Okay, so in this case, we have an expired placard being used here. So that would be the violation that we're writing for. And if you see these photographs, you'll notice that, we've got a picture of the front of the vehicle, a picture of the back of the vehicle there. We really want to make sure that we show the court that we've investigated this vehicle, and here's what we're seeing. So this would be good photos for an expired placard violation. Okay, and our second one, keep scrolling down. Okay. In this case, this would be a violation for parking without a placard. Keep scrolling there. Okay, and then if we go to our third one, this would be an example of blocking an access aisle here. You can see that if the white vehicle there tries to get out of their vehicle, and let's say that they have a lift or they have a wheelchair that they need to get out of their car, it's going to be very difficult for them to use that access aisle because we've got the motorcycle parked in it. So this would be, the motorcycle is committing a blocking an access aisle violation. Okay, and then so this is another example of blocking here. You can see that this person is trying to exit their vehicle and is not able to because this white vehicle is blocking their access there. Okay, so keep going. Yep. And if we go now to the next slide.
Oh, just the next slide.
Yep. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Hang on just a second. Let me figure this out.
You gotta go.
All right. Where does that take you?
Okay. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so I have a question here. What does accessible parking do for people with disabilities? If you want to just, there we go. It's about access, not convenience. I think that's one of the most common, misconceptions is people will say, I'm only just going to be there for 1 minute. So what's the big deal? They look at accessible parking more as, a place to just pop in to a store really quickly, when for a person with a disability, it really creates access for them to be able to go to the grocery store and access the products and services they need to do in their lives. It creates more energy and health to do other things for people with disabilities. If I'm able to find an accessible parking space, it means that I am able to get across the parking lot quicker. I have less walking to the front door, and therefore I'm saving my energy to be able to do other things with my family that are, or my friends that are important to me. Should we go to the next one? It creates full participation for people with disabilities. So it allows me equal access to everything people without disabilities have access to. So if I'm able to find an accessible parking space, I can go grocery shopping, I can do the things that I want to do in my life. It creates access for the use of lift vehicles and assistive devices. So if I have an accessible van, it allows, that access aisle or striped area next to an accessible parking space allows me to fully deploy my ramp and exit the vehicle safely. It also allows me to open my door wide enough so I can get my wheelchair out. If I've got someone assisting me getting out of my vehicle, it allows enough space for that to happen. It also, makes sure that everybody can kind of see me in the parking lot and sort of, know that I'm exiting. And because when you're using a wheelchair, sometimes, you can be lower to the ground and other drivers may not see you. So accessible parking allows for all of those things to happen. Lastly, it creates a safe path of travel from the parking lot to the door. So if I cannot find an accessible parking space, and I'm having to park clear at the back of a lot, it means that I may have to travel behind more cars if I'm in a wheelchair, and that is actually risky for me, because other drivers may not see me because I'm low to the ground. So if I have an accessible parking space, make sure that I have a place up front where everyone can see where I'm going and getting to the front door safely. So misuse of accessible parking placards. Chief, do you want to talk about
Yes,
this?
yes. That's one of the focal points for the law enforcement to really concentrate on, as well as the others. But with this one, we have a lot of abuse of the placards where individuals that have placards are loaning them to other individuals so they can also take advantage of convenient spaces in a lot of commercial properties. And that is a violation to do that, and it's subject to seizure of the placard as well as a citation to the offender. So, yeah.
Okay, and so a little bit more on altered these placards. You know, it's against the law to alter your placard.
We see quite a bit of that,
yeah.
where people will alter some of the markings on the placard, the hole punch. You'll see on a placard, you'll have a month and a year indicated when it expires for quick view, but also a little closer look, there'll be a hole punch for the month and the year, and of course those have to match. And a lot of times individuals will alter those placards, in which of course that is a violation of law. Now, the other thing that we're seeing that's a little bit more difficult to enforce is that some placards are being sold on websites like eBay and things of that nature, where they're very difficult to enforce because it's considered a novelty until it is actually used for illegal parking purposes. So it makes prosecution pretty difficult. But we are trying to concentrate on that. The other thing is that it's manpower intensive to deal with these altered placards and fictitious placards because you have to wait for the offender to be at the vehicle. It's not just you see a vehicle parked inappropriately in a disabled parking spot. We actually have to make contact with the driver. And that a lot of times that takes quite a bit of manpower hours to make contact with these individuals and see if a violation has actually taken place, so then we can cite them and seize the placards.
I have a quick question for you myself.
Yes.
Do you have any suggestions on how that can be monitored better, or something can happen to the placard? Is there another process that should be going on to make those placards less tamper resistant and so forth? Do you have any ideas yourself?
No, I really don't have a solution to this. Individuals that have disabled license plates certainly are affixed to that vehicle. Mm-hmm. The placard, for the convenience of the disabled individual, lends itself where that placard belongs to them, so they can catch a ride with any vehicle and they have the privilege of using that. So there really isn't anything that comes to mind that could help monitor that. What we find that a lot of the offenders is they're using placards belonging to a relative, like grandma, and somebody that's disabled that happens to be at home, so they'll use their placard and they'll go out about their day. There's also a misconception that we oftentimes see is that they believe that if they are going shopping for the disabled person, with the disabled person not with them, that they can use the placard. And it doesn't work that way. The disabled person who owns that placard needs to be there with them because it's for their purpose, for their benefit, for their accessibility. Okay. So it's used inappropriately in all those circumstances.
We have a couple of questions. One second, let me read it first. Okay. If there's somebody you think that is abusing the placard, maybe a single lot where it's just one business, do officers go in and ask the manager to call the person outside to that license plate number, or do they do anything like that?
No, we don't do that and try to track an individual down. We wait for them to come to the vehicle, okay, so that then we know that they were driving that vehicle.
Okay.
We actually can attest to the fact that we saw them occupying that vehicle.
Another question, what does an average week look like for the full-time deputy as he or she engages in stopping abuse of accessible parking in Austin? What is the most common parking citation the deputies see, and how often do they have to approach vehicles with placards like downtown parking at 3 meters?
That's a very good question. Our deputies focus primarily in Precinct 5, which is the downtown area.
Okay.
And it's no surprise that parking is at a premium in the downtown area. We try to spend quite a bit of our time in the parking garages. There's a lot of disabled parking places in those garages, and they're quite often abused there. The city of Austin has their own staff that monitor the meters, and certainly an individual with a placard is exempt from the meter. We don't usually deal with those. That's not our primary focus.
Okay.
Our primary focus are the other commercial property areas where they're being used, or state office buildings where they're being used, and we see a lot of that. In fact, just a few months ago, we were getting reports that a state office building seemed to have an unusual amount of disabled parking placards displayed around the building. So there was a suspicion that it was being abused, so we decided to test that theory, and we organized this thing early in the morning before the state workers came to work, and we engaged about 60 individuals as they came up to work. And out of those 60 individuals, we only issued about 6 citations. So for us, it kind of dispelled that theory that it was being abused. There were some that needed some education about how to properly use it. There were some, for example, that were parking with a disabled placard belonging to another individual because they were going to a meeting later, so they want to have a convenient parking place. Things of that nature. But it dispelled that theory, and it just goes to show that we have a very robust disabled community that are out there working and doing everything just like anybody else, and they just needed that convenience. So they were using it correctly.
And one last question, are all disabled vet plates allowed to park in marked handicap parking spots?
If they are a disabled veteran and the registration indicates it as such, yes, it's the same privilege as having a placard.
Okay.
Not all military registrations are disabled. So you really have to look at the license plate to determine if it's a disabled veteran or not. Because you may have, for example, a Purple Heart. They would be. There's some other Bronze Stars and things of that nature that are not in and of themselves allowed to do that. But if they are listed specifically as disabled, yes, they are.
So essentially, what you're looking for on a disabled license plate, what we train our volunteers for, is you're looking for a statement which is on the bottom of the disabled license plate that says Disabled Veteran U.S. Armed Forces. Sometimes you will also see the international symbol of access, which is the wheelchair symbol. Sometimes you may not on a disabled plate, or a disabled veteran plate, because that, the wheelchair symbol is not required. So really, you're looking for that statement.
Can any disability acquired by a veteran qualify for the disabled veteran parking privilege, or is it just mobility related?
I'm not sure what the actual regulations are. I know the disabled veteran qualifications are different. I think they do it by percentages. So I'm not sure what percentage actually gets you a disabled veteran plate. So I mean, that would.
We understand widows or widowers of disabled veterans can apply for a disabled veteran plate based on the service record of their deceased spouse.
Yeah.
But just to be clear, they are not to use that to park in an accessible parking spot if
Right.
they themselves do not have a disability.
Right. That would be an example of a military service plate, essentially. A disabled spouse of a disabled veteran, would be an example of a military service plate versus a disabled veteran.
Well, they can actually get a disabled veteran military service plate according to the law that passed in the last session. But just to be clear, they should not use it for parking.
In a disabled place, that's correct.
Okay, so if I could just back up for 1 second here.
Sorry about that.
I do have kind of an option when we were talking about, you know, how do we you know, maybe, you know, limit or help illegal use. One of the things I would suggest is, you know, currently the law, you can choose either getting 2 disabled placards or accessible placards, or you can get, if you own your vehicle, you can get a disabled license plate and 1 placard. I'm always encouraging people that if they own their vehicle or they know they're going to be, you know, in a vehicle, you know, say it's a family vehicle, to really encourage them to go ahead and get the disabled plate, and that one accessible placard. I think that's one way we could limit the amount of placards that are being issued, and you know, maybe that would make an impact on illegal use and altered placards.
Next question.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so name 1 accessible parking violation. We've got parking in an accessible space without an accessible placard or plate. We've got blocking an access aisle, using someone else's placard, which a volunteer cannot issue a citation for, using an expired placard.
Now, to clarify, using the expired placard, the courts have recently, and the prosecutors have recently given us direction, the prosecutors have, that saying if the placard is expired, that in and of itself is not a violation. What that means is that placard is no longer valid, and it's the same as not having a placard. Now, if they get a citation when they have an expired placard and they remedy that within a certain time frame, the courts will dismiss that violation.
Okay, so which placard has been altered? We go down. So here we have a temporary placard. We can see the hole punches that Chief was talking about. So if we look, we can actually see that the red placard looks like it's been altered. You can see 2 hole punches there. We see February has been punched, and we also see December that has been punched. And then we actually see that the year was 2012. So this person actually turned that 2 into a 3 and added a 1 to the 2. So you can see how people, you know, do alter their placards.
So that's subject to a violation and the seizure of the placard.
Yeah. So true or false, a person can use someone else's placard without the placard owner being present if they are running errands for them. And we all know we all know the answer to that now. False.
Right.
Correct. Okay, so blocking inaccessible parking space, I do want to go over this because it, you know, it really is a common violation, I would say, and really makes it difficult for drivers with disabilities and people with disabilities in general. So blocking facts, it is a violation to block an accessible parking space, even if you have a valid accessible parking placard or a license plate. So even if there's no accessible parking and you really got to get into that store, even if you have a disabled plate or a placard, you cannot block an access aisle. You can still receive a citation, even if you do have the proper requirements there. It's also a violation to obstruct a curb cut, ramp, or anything designed to assist people with disabilities or wheelchair access. So really, what I tell people is you really got to stop and sort of look around you and observe what's happening in your environment. To go to the next screen there. So again, are you parked on or occupying most of a striped area if you're a driver? Can other drivers use the accessible parking spaces around you? These are all questions that, you know, I talk to my volunteers about. And I talk to people, you know, who call in, who get blocking violations, you know, to try and educate them on what the access file is being used for. So drivers with lift vehicles need 8 to 10 feet to deploy their lift and safely exit. This means that they got to get the lift completely out and be able to exit, actually get down, use the ramp and get down from it. So it's not enough just for the ramp to come out. The person actually needs to get down and actually exit their vehicle completely. And then can pedestrians, including those with disabilities, reach the sidewalk or enter a business safely? These are all questions to ask yourself.
We have a couple of questions again. Does the signage have to display the fine amount in order to be legally marked disabled parking spot?
No, the only thing that the ADA requires is that signage have the wheelchair symbol on it. So the fine that you will see on some signs, it does not need to be there in order for it to be enforceable.
All right.
All we need is to have that wheelchair symbol and have it be 5 feet above, you know, from the ground.
Gotcha. Why can it not be made illegal to sell or transfer a placard? I'm not sure we have an answer to that. I guess it would take legislation to make that happen. So, Kay, you might want to talk to your local representative or senator to encourage that type of change in the statute. Ron, do you want to add something?
Did you get a reading from your county attorneys on that, where they explicitly said it is not already illegal to sell a placard on Craigslist?
Well, the issue is it has to be used illegally. The way the statute reads, it's illegal to sell or possess. However, there's a lot of novelty items being used. So for it to be a valid charge where you can get prosecution for, what the courts are looking for is for it to be used for that illicit purpose. And that's where we have that disconnect. That's where we have that issue. So that charge is really hard to make.
Many people with many with disabilities can't access the parking garages. Due to not being able to use the ticket machines because of the disability. Plus focus on surface parking. They're asking you to please focus on surface parking too, not just the garages if possible. For many of us to use accessible parking, that's the only option.
And I want to clarify too that our deputies, I mean,
if they're parking in a public street that happens to have a disabled parking sign, yes, they will enforce that. The issue that we often can't deal with effectively is if it's a regular parking spot that a disabled person is using with their placard. We don't deal with those near as often as the city does to enforce those.
Okay.
Right, but I mean, I would say that our deputy does issue tickets. I mean, at shopping centers, in parking garages, we are issuing tickets
everywhere
and anywhere.
Yeah.
All right.
In Travis County.
Let's go ahead here.
Okay, go ahead. So blocking examples, here's another one of those photo albums. Here's just more examples. These are actual violations that have been
committed. Our deputies pictured there on the left.
Mm-hmm. So you see this.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Keep going. Okay, we can.
Clear violation there.
Yep. Here's another one. Just to kind of give you an idea,
because those big trucks think they can, they got a wide space saved just for them, right?
Well, some people get confused. They think that the striped area is where the disabled vehicle needs to be parked, and that's not the case at all. They go into a regular parking place. The striped area is to be left open for access for the ramps and things like that. So some people, even with disabilities, get confused over how they're supposed to park in some of these areas.
Okay, there you see a lift vehicle actually being operated there. That's a truck lift. And you can see the,
Now they can't get back in.
yep.
Right.
And then we have another motorcycle here. Okay, so we're at the end of that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's okay. I'm doing something wrong with there we go.
Okay, and then just to give you an idea of accessible vehicles, oh, that's another.
Okay.
These are some accessible motorcycles. I like to go through this because there's many different ways to modify a vehicle, and I think it's important to really know that and understand that, particularly if you're going to be volunteering. So there's another one, and another one.
Pretty cool.
And then so we have accessible trucks. There we see.
The motorcycles that will have a disabled license plate, they will have disabled registration on those motorcycles.
Yeah. And then we have SUVs.
What is the most common vehicle?
I would say it's the van. If you keep scrolling down,
Okay.
that's another SUV. So this is probably the most common vehicle. So we have the van here. You can see we can do a lift from the side, which I think is the most common way, and then we can do a lift in the back. But I just kind of wanted to give you an idea there of what we're talking about. Okay, true or false, if a person has a placard, an access aisle obstructor, it can be used as an accessible parking space when all others are being used. What do we think the answer to that is? False.
False.
Yep.
I win the prize.
Okay. Okay, so Chief went over this
Early on.
so we can kind of maybe scroll down to our current program. And I just kind of want to give you an idea of what makes what we have learned over the years and what makes our program successful, because we have been doing this for over 20 years. So it's been a long time. Currently, we now have 92 volunteers. As Chief said, between 2013, when Constable Lopez took office, and now, we have really created educational awareness materials. We've streamlined our training, and I kind of want to expand on that for you a little bit. So essentially, we've really made it more interactive. Our training still remains at 4 hours according to our state law, but the way we do it in our program, because I think 4 hours is a long time for one person to kind of sit and try to absorb all of the material that we're giving them. And I think it's really important that all my volunteers really have a good understanding of what's going on. So the way that I've done it, we have a 1 hour face-to-face where the volunteer will come in and we'll discuss policies and procedures and expectations for the program. We kind of go over basic citation writing, and then we have a 3 hour training that, of course, reviews the state laws and regulations. We do practice writing citations, but we do a lot more field scenarios. We actually will take our volunteers out and set up scenarios with them, with vehicles, and actually have them write citations on real vehicles. We talk about judgments and what makes a violation versus what makes a blocking violation versus what makes a bad parking job. We really do try to give that volunteer as much real field experience as we can. We talk a lot about judgments. We talk a lot about field safety. We discuss a lot of different photographs and what makes a good photograph versus maybe one that doesn't capture the information we need it to. I've really worked with my volunteers to really update our training materials into something that they want to use. I've used them a lot to update our manual and I have a quick reference guide and different citation writing forms that they have really helped me develop so that they really feel invested in our program. We've streamlined our citation submission process so that all citations and photos are submitted by email. You know, when our volunteers come in to sign their affidavits, you know, they have their own folders that will be up at the front so that it's really kind of a quick thing for them to kind of come in and sign all the affidavits that they have. It takes about 15 minutes and then they're out the door. So we've established volunteer meetings and we have a volunteer newsletter. You know, we're really working with the local media, trying to get the word out about, you know, about our accessible parking enforcement stings on Black Friday and tax-free weekend. And I've established a lot of resources for law enforcement agencies who want to start their own programs.
I just want to quickly say that we really value our volunteers. They are a tremendous asset to this particular mission. Statistically, they issue about anywhere from 54 to 60% of the citations being issued to the courts. So that's a substantial amount, and we think that's a huge contribution to disabled parking enforcement and education.
Yeah, and I really cannot say enough, you know, in terms of training the volunteers, is to really kind of get them involved in actually training. When we do field scenarios, I will involve a lot of our experienced volunteers, and they'll kind of be on hand to help the newer volunteers through the citation writing process, help them with judgment calls and sort of, you know, taking photographs and stuff like that. But the more you invest in your volunteers, the more they feel connected to the program, the better your volunteer program.
The judgment part, what we're getting at there is they're empowered also. If they're unsure, they can write a warning citation. It's not issued to the court. There are no fines associated. It's an educational opportunity if it's a questionable violation or not. So that also helps as well.
Chief, I have a question. This is Ron Lucy with the Governor's Committee. For any communities or jurisdictions that are out there that are considering creating a volunteer parking enforcement program and they want to talk to their city manager or their county judge, can these programs be revenue neutral or even revenue positive, or do they cost more funds to administer than they potentially bring in terms of fines?
You know, the interesting part about law enforcement is that it's not supposed to be a revenue generating operation. So we don't really have direct access to the data as to how much revenue it generates. The fine amounts on these violations are pretty substantial, but there's also a long list of exceptions that individuals have that will get the case dismissed. So we never really truly track or unable to track from all the courts which violation got fined, which one didn't, or how any other way it could have been remedied. So it does generate some revenue like all Class C offenses do because it's a fine-only violation. So it does generate some revenue to those entities. A lot of the money goes to the state rather than that particular community. The state is the one that's the main benefit from all these fines. But it does generate sufficient amount to where there is some offset to what the cost is to administer the program. The overhead for it is not, from our estimation, is not that substantial. We have a lot of clerical staff that we can have. We happen to have one dedicated strictly for disabled parking affidavits and things of that nature, strictly for that program. But a lot of entities can be very creative as to how they do it. The same with law enforcement. If they are, you can channel your enforcement efforts to whatever the problems may be. And if it happens to be disabled parking, then you can channel your efforts there, as we've done on stings. So the revenue generation should not be the motivating factor. It is what is important for the community and what is important for the disabled community.
We're going to go ahead and move on we want to make sure we get through this section.
Okay, so I just want to go through some best practices, and this is just a screen here. So I'll just talk about the and I do have some worksheets that I can provide everyone later. Essentially, best practices for our program. One of the things that worked is to split up our 4-hour training. So you may consider doing that, trying to keep things as interactive as possible and not relying so much on a PowerPoint. The best trainings have no more than about 20 participants at a time. I find that especially if you're going to do field scenarios, keeping your training smaller so that you're not herding cats is pretty important and something that I have learned over the years. Demonstrate using actual vehicles and accessible parking spaces. Encourage training ideas from volunteers and ask them to assist during training. Encourage discussion and use of photos of actual citations. If choosing to use a PowerPoint presentation, do so in conjunction with a more interactive learning strategies, and conduct regular evaluations, listen to your trainees, and update your training accordingly. So now if Chief, you want to go over the number of citations we've issued?
Well, we've issued quite a lot. We range anywhere from 2,700 to 3,200 annually. So they really vary fast. I think we need to move the program along. But and that's a combination of our volunteers and deputies enforcement. The dedicated deputy, as well as our other deputies, are around the community. And that's strictly our office, not all of Travis County. So that's certainly a substantial amount of citations being issued. With the population that is certainly attracted to the Austin and Travis County area, we were hoping that we could decline some of those citation and violations that we witnessed, but I think with more people coming in, you have more violations.
And we're going to hold any more questions for you all till the end. I want to go ahead and move to Mack Marsh's session. And Mack Marsh is with Parking Mobility. And Mack, go ahead and please introduce yourself.
Good morning. Thanks. I appreciate y'all having me. I'm the Executive Director for Parking Mobility. Parking Mobility is a nonprofit organization that was developed by the disability community specifically to address accessible parking abuse. As an advocate, longtime advocate for employment, housing, transportation, one of the things that we continue to run up against as a complaint by people with disabilities was lack of parking, being able to access their community because other people are violating accessible parking spaces. Of course, there was a lot of complaints about it, but we recognized many years ago that we didn't have a whole lot of data. So there wasn't a whole lot of studies that had been done on this issue. We started looking at what could we find, and it wasn't a lot. So we initially developed the Parking Mobility app, which is a smartphone app that you can access on your iPhone and your Android. If you have a BlackBerry, sorry, we don't support that anymore. We used to have the BlackBerry app, but it's just not a market. We don't develop for Windows apps yet. We are looking at developing for that. So the app was originally developed specifically to collect data. For us to be able to understand the problem. I'm a big believer that when you know what the numbers tell you, then you can start to get to some real solutions. So we started collecting that data back in 2011, 2012. I want to flash forward a little bit to last year, 2017. Which was really our most active year worldwide, as well as here in Texas. So in 2017, just in Texas, we had 2,213 active app users. These are individual people who had downloaded and used the app to report at least one violation. All of the violations are monitored, so we do look at those to make sure that they would meet the requirement for a citation. Of those 2,000 people, they submitted about 20,000 violation reports. We're very data heavy, so we know what types of violations they were reporting. Much like the Constable's office, our volunteers cannot report anything relative to a placard abuse. So they can report for a vehicle that's parked with no plate, no placard. Those are the most common, with a little over half of those citation reports being issued. Blocking access aisles, curb cuts, ramps is the second most common, with a little over 6,000 of the reports being those. We see quite a few expired and altered placards. That's a real problem, and I want to talk a bit about that in a little while. But we had about 747 of those reports. And then we get a lot of reports of people who don't display their placards properly. So the state law requires that the placard be hung from the rearview mirror with the expiration date facing out. The placard itself gives a little different instruction. It says it must be hung from the rearview mirror or placed prominently on the dash. And so with our volunteers, we actually don't issue citations for that violation type, but we do send out an educational letter that shows their vehicle and how they had their placard displayed, and then shows their vehicle with a properly displayed placard. So our technology kind of plays a neat little trick and properly displays their placard for them so that they can see how they should have done that. And that really helps to engage folks. We've actually found that to be a pretty good recruiting tool. We've had a lot of people that have gotten those warning letters that have been called us, wanted more information about the program, and have become volunteers. So we're really excited about that. We collected that data all across Texas. We had 95 Texas counties that someone submitted some data to us. Obviously, the larger populated areas are where the vast majority of those programs come. So we're starting to show that, yes, there is a real problem with accessible parking abuse. It's not just in Texas. We have 100,000 users here in the United States. We have 300,000 users worldwide. We've gotten violation reports. We regularly get violation reports from every continent, except Antarctica, but that's because the signs keep blowing down. So we go to the next slide if I can. So one of the things that we found with our data, one of the things that we really wanted to do with our data was to tie it to what was going on at the time and currently. And so we started really talking to stakeholders at all levels. We talked with everybody from violators to potential volunteers, the disability community, those that support people with disabilities. We started talking with community administrators and lawmakers and decision makers. We started talking to law enforcement. We talked to judges and prosecutors. We really wanted to get an understanding of what everybody, every stakeholder at every level, what their understanding was, what their concerns were, and really how could we get to some really good potentials. One of the things that we found very early on was that regardless of how the enforcement was done, whether it was by a law enforcement officer or it was by a volunteer program, that there were really high dismissal rates. So dismissal rates for citations that were being written were as high as 80%. And that was really disturbing for us, because what that showed was a lack of either an understanding of the people who were writing the citations or a lack of understanding of people who were adjudicating those citations. One of the biggest things that we found, and one of the things that was the most surprising to us as advocates, was that the high fines contributed to those high dismissal rates. So Texas has one of the highest fines in the country at $500 minimum, thanks to that House bill in 2009. And we understand as advocates how that came about. We felt that a high fine would be a deterrent to these types of violations. But the problem was that just wasn't enough enforcement, and there was no education around that enforcement. And so what happens is a lot of judges are very hesitant to find someone guilty when they know that they have to impose that really high fine. We also found a lot of prosecutors that were real hesitant to prosecute cases because they felt that the fines were very high. Police officers that we talked to said, well, I'm not going to write somebody a $500 ticket just because they may be over the line a little bit, or they just parked there because it was raining. And it was because they're not directly affected by this problem. They didn't understand why those fines were so high. And so a lot of it really comes down to an understanding of the issue. We talked a lot to the disability community as well, and especially in communities that didn't have a commitment to enforcement, so they didn't have a volunteer program, or their law enforcement wasn't writing a lot of citations, or there was a lot of really high dismissal rates. And they have become very frustrated, and we see this across the country. Everything from people posting really nasty notes on people's cars that when they think that that person shouldn't be using an accessible space, which is totally inappropriate and ineffective, all the way down to damaging vehicles. We've actually seen people that will key someone's car, which is completely inappropriate and illegal behavior. And we really want to engage the disability community so that they have a positive and proactive way to get involved without actually creating a bigger problem. The other thing that we saw was a lot of point of infraction confrontation. So when someone sees someone who's parked illegally, they will go over and say something to them. I was guilty of this very early on with my disability. And even when I was trying to be very positive, when I was trying to be educational to someone, what we found is that the violators go into one of two modes. They either go into fight or flight. And if they go into that fight mode, then they're going to fight back. They're going to tell you why what they did wasn't wrong. Or they're going to go into flight mode. They're going to tell you anything that you want to hear just so they can get away from that situation. But it didn't change their behavior. We saw a lot of recidivism, still see quite a bit of recidivism in situations where people are confronted at the point of infraction. So we started looking at those traditional volunteer programs. Travis County was fantastic to get this kicked off in Texas and to really show a lead across the United States to deploy the first program in 1996. It's, you know, like Tanya mentioned, it's a paper ticket-based program where the volunteer writes a paper ticket. They take photographs of that vehicle to collect more information and more evidence, and then they post that paper ticket on the vehicle. There's a lot of problems with that. We talked with a lot of volunteers who had been in that program or wanted to be in that program, and their biggest concern was accessibility of that program. So a lot of volunteers can't press hard enough on the copy or can't write legibly enough to be able to actually write out the citation. There was a lot of turnover in those programs, and we talked with a lot of people who had been in the Houston program in particular. Houston has a very large program, but they had really high turnover rates, at 80% turnover rate annually in their volunteers. We asked a lot of those volunteers why, and their biggest complaint besides accessibility was lack of transparency. So they would write a ticket, but they never knew what happened with that ticket. They never know whether it was dismissed. They didn't know if the person paid a fine. They didn't know what happened, and there was no visibility into that system. The only feedback they got was negative feedback. So the only time they knew what happened with the ticket was when they got called to court for somebody to contest that ticket. And then there was a lot of confrontation potential. A lot of people said they didn't like being in the program because it took several minutes to write a ticket. So they were standing next to that vehicle for quite some time, and there was a lot of opportunity for the owners of the vehicle to confront those volunteers. There are other programs, mainly in North Texas, that have been patrol-based. Those tend to kind of pop up and then fail really quickly because they're really expensive. That's where basically your local community is putting people into a community-owned vehicle, a marked vehicle. They typically have to wear a uniform. They typically have to go out at specific times or in specific areas. And they're not very effective because very quickly the community learns those patterns. So if you go out and you just enforce at the mall, then people know, don't park like that at the mall. But they're out there parking at Walmart and H-E-B and Randall's and everywhere else. They just don't do it at the mall, or they don't do it at the mall on Saturday, but they will on Sunday because they know that the volunteers aren't patrolling on Sunday. So the patrol-based programs really don't work. And then the biggest problem that we found, and this is really talking with the judges and talking with the volunteers and the violators, was that there was a lack of education. There was really no understanding of what rules are why those spaces exist, or how to use them appropriately. So you can go to the next slide if you would.
Can I just real quick, Ron, would you speak to don't we have a parking recommendation that is related to education?
Yeah, we have a parking report, which I believe Fran shared information on yesterday, and there's 12 recommendations in there. We can go over that at the end. But,
Okay,
yeah,
the
one in the back is specifically referring to making education an alternative sentencing option for judges is in our recommendation to the legislature. And so we're hoping that advocates will pick that up again in the 86th session and go forward with that because, as Mr. Marsh said, the high fines can be a deterrent for prosecutors or judges following through on convicting somebody of parking illegally.
And what those dismissal rates do, what those high dismissal rates do, is they send the message to the community that this is not an issue that we care about. And what happens is we see a lot of recidivism. So people who get those dismissals repeat offend over and over and over again. We actually just ran a report for Travis County that found a 65% recidivism rate in the population of people who got a ticket and then had that citation dismissed. So what we've done with that data that we were collecting and those interviews that we had and those roundtables that we had across the state and across the country was we developed a program that we felt would adequately address the issue in a really turnkey way. A lot of the administrators that we talked to across the state said, well, we'd love to do more about this, but we can't spend any money. This is not an issue that we can spend money on. And so what we did was we developed a program that we felt would solve all of those problems. We worked with Hayes County, just south of Austin, which we felt was a pretty good representation of what Texas looks like. It has some rural, it has some urban, it has a high retail traffic area. And so we deployed a pilot program with them 6 years ago. And what we did was we really brought a lot of ownership to the disability community. So we reached out to folks with disabilities. We reached out to people who had already downloaded the app because they were angry about this issue. We started recruiting them. We provide the same types of training that Tanya mentioned earlier. We do it a little bit differently. We do the initial 4 hours of training, but then our volunteers are required to have quarterly training as well. We provide that both online and in person. A lot of it is driven by what their activities are. So we do a lot of monitoring of our volunteers. We provide them with some technology. So using the same app that anybody can download, we actually elevate those accounts once they've completed those trainings, once they've had their background checks by our local jurisdiction partners, once they've been sworn in as a certified volunteer, then their account gets elevated and their accounts can then be reviewed for citation. They don't put a ticket on the vehicle itself. Those citations are mailed by our law enforcement partners after they've been reviewed. And so there's a lot of efficiencies there. The volunteers sign their affidavits and their complaints electronically. They also sign them physically once a report has been called to court. We also provide a lot of information for our community partners. So we have a dashboard where our law enforcement partners can log in. They can see that program at a glance. They can see how many citations are being issued over a given period of time. They can see hotspot mapping, so they can see where those violations are occurring. They can see violations versus just reports by casual users. They can see places where maybe we need to recruit volunteers. It's very data heavy. Which helps really make the program very efficient and effective. One of the things that Chief Gutierrez mentioned earlier was that it's difficult to address placard abuse. You know, people using someone else's placard maybe in a downtown corridor. One of the things that our program does is it collects a lot of data that can make that much more efficient. If we know that on Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock, you're more likely to find this violation type in this block, then that helps the law enforcement officers to be able to target that area at various times throughout the year instead of just on those big days. And so it helps to make that a really efficient, effective way to address those types of situations. It also leverages, one of the big programs that we do is leverage that enforcement activity. So our volunteers and our law enforcement officers, instead of just being about enforcement, it also provides an educational alternative. As Ron mentioned earlier, there is a hope that we can get this into state law, but there's nothing right now that keeps a judge from allowing a violator to take a class and to learn about why these spaces exist and to hopefully change their behavior. So we've actually worked now with Travis County for 4 years and with Hays County for 6 to provide an educational alternative for violators. We've tracked that population throughout that entire time. There's 0 recidivism amongst people who've gotten a ticket, were given that educational alternative, and they haven't repeat offended. And so that really has proven that we can change behavior through education. Where we'd really like to get to with that, with the legislature, is to get some proactive education. So I've just described reactive education. Somebody does something bad and then we educate them. With proactive education, we really want to start educating people on the front end. When you get a plate or a placard, you really should get information on what the rules are. And right now you don't. We really should be able to educate new drivers. So in our driver's education programs, we need to have information about accessible parking and access in our communities. In our state driver handbook, we need more than the 1 paragraph of information on the accessible parking that currently exists. We need at least a page, maybe 2, to really explain the importance of these spaces and why they exist. In our driver or in our motorcycle handbook, we need more than 2 sentences on accessible parking, and especially on those access aisles. And right now, that's all that exists. We've actually been to some of the motorcycle dealerships where they tell their customers those striped areas are for motorcycle parking, and they're not. And so we need to do better at educating people on the front end, but then also on the back end. When someone does something that's inappropriate, we really need to educate them. One of the big things we found in Travis County is that 42% of the people who are violating are people with disabilities. And so we really need to do better at educating the disability community as well, educating ourselves as to what those rules are and why we need to follow those rules appropriately. And then the other thing that it does, Kay asked a question earlier about getting some laws passed on selling placards, and you know, we want to do some advocating at the Capitol to change some of 681 to allow for more education, better enforcement, more information on the training that needs to be done. Travis County Precinct 5 does a great job in their training program. They hit every button they should with their volunteers. We feel like we do too, but we've seen some really bad training programs out there because there's no standards, and so there needs to be some standards, and we'd like to get there. But the big thing that we need as advocates is some data. We need people collecting data using the Parking Mobility app, giving the feedback, helping us understand that whether you're in Alpine, Texas, or you're in Longview or Texarkana, or Austin or Houston or Dallas, the more data that we have, the more people that we have engaged in this process, the more data that we have, the better we can have those conversations, the better we can prove that there's a big problem out there, and that we have those numbers to back that up, not just the stories and complaints of the disability community. And then lastly, we really want to use that data and the things that we're learning in the program to drive our community awareness and education programs. So we do a lot of work with community groups, civic organizations. We go out, we actually do a driver training for FedEx. We'd love to have UPS on board. So anybody from UPS that's watching, give us a call. We'll be happy to come out and talk to your drivers because we see a lot of issues with those delivery drivers who are parking in those spaces. And we need to do a better job of raising their awareness, raising their understanding that them doing that is actually harming the community. It's not just people with disabilities. It also harms our economy. When people can't park and spend their money, then that hurts everybody. So I think that Randy's got our contact information. So just want to really end this with, if you go to the next slide, to to let you know that if you really care about accessible parking, if you really want to make your community a safer, more accessible place for everybody, the solution's in your hand. Everybody's got a smartphone these days, and downloading and using the Parking Mobility app is really the onboarding point to get involved, regardless of what community you're in, and to join this campaign to end accessible parking abuse.
So a question for you, Matt.
Sure.
You have to be a volunteer to use the mobile app and issue illegal parking tickets on the app.
So everybody can use the app, and we really encourage everybody to use the app. What happens with your report is really determined by where you report and who you are. So if you've gone through the training program, if you're in one of the communities that we've partnered with, where they are recruiting volunteers, then you'll be given information about training. You'll be given information on how you can get more involved. But really those reports that are in non-partner communities, so if you're in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, if you're in Longview, if you're in Tyler, those reports are actually more important than the ones that result in a citation, because those are the reports that we help to educate our community leaders on the need for this program and get more communities on board. But it really depends. So every report's important. Every report is critical. It doesn't matter if you've been through training yet. Your report does count. If you expect a citation to be issued, that depends.
All right, this could be anyone. Another question, I can only use the van designated space. I unload a power chair and unload it using a boom lift. Sometimes I have to park a little bit into the marked aisle to have room to unload it. This is because people who do not need the van spaces. Oh, this is because people that do not need the van spaces when they do not need it. I think they're saying they park in them when they don't need it. Is this a violation?
As a van user, nothing frustrates me more than to see a smart car parked in a van accessible space. State law does not make van spaces van only. And in fact, one of the things that we found is that we probably don't need to do that, at least until we raise some education and awareness. Let's let the data drive what changes to law we need to have. But it's not a violation for a vehicle that's not a van to be parked in those van spots. If you drive a van, you really should be the most aware of those areas. We see a lot of people that drive vans that will park in those striped areas because they think that that's their area. It's not. It's a shared space. It's a space that anybody needs to have access to. So a lot of times I'll have to back my van in order to deploy my lift on the appropriate side where the stripes are. And that's really what you should do. I want to go back and touch on a couple of questions that came up earlier that we didn't address from our perspective. So one of the questions, Ron, you asked was the cost positive versus cost neutrality of a program. One of the things that we proved with Parking Mobility is that we can provide a cost positive solution. So with Parking Mobility, every community that we've deployed in has made more off of revenue from the program than the program cost them. But you have to be very efficient. You have to be very effective in providing those solutions. And that's really what Parking Mobility can provide, is that efficiency and effectiveness.
What is the cost share with Parking Mobility for those communities that choose to enroll?
So it's based on the demographics of that community. The larger the community, obviously, the more work we're going to have to do, the more work, the more cost. We deployed in Travis County initially at a cost of $75,000 per year. Last year, the county cleared $180,000 above the cost of the program. So we actually, a little over $250,000 was revenue from the program, revenue to the county. So it can be cost positive. We just have to work with that community to get it there.
You mentioned an education program. Is that a web-based training program?
It is. So we provide our offender education program at the order of the court. So the court has to approve that person to be able to take that class. They take that class online. We do offer it once per month in our partner jurisdictions in person. there are people in this world that don't use computers. And so if they just can't use computer, don't have access to computer, we do have a monthly in-person offender education course. It's funny when those folks show up, a lot of those people are people with disabilities. They're elderly typically because they don't use computers. I am not trying to say that to be biased, but that's just the fact. But what they do is they show up and they're very angry. I don't need this class. I have a disability. I shouldn't have gotten a ticket. By the time they leave, they're thanking us. Everybody should have this information. Everybody should know what these rules are. And that's really proof that we need to do better at proactive education.
Is your class behind a paywall, or is that a class you can share with people?
If anybody wants to contact me, we have a sample class that I can certainly forward on a link to.
We had a question yesterday that I want to direct to the county's office, because they wanted to know how to convince a local police chief to implement such a program, a volunteer program. And Mack, you can answer this too in a minute, but they were really interested in trying to get some kind of volunteer enforcement program set up in their county, and the police chief won't even consider it. So, and it's, I'm not going to say what city, but it's a decent sized city. It's not a big city. It's not a tiny, teeny weeny city. A bedroom community to a larger city. So how, any ideas on how this individual might go approach a county or a city department to set up such a program?
You know, in law enforcement, our mission is to try to serve the community and understand what the issues are and that are important to the community. The statute allows for any governmental body. So there are a lot of overlaps when it comes to law enforcement. For example, a city happens to be in a county. So a county has countywide jurisdiction. The city has just municipal jurisdiction. So I would suggest you reach out to the county law enforcement agencies, because they can serve the non-incorporated as well as incorporated areas that happen to be in the county. So that they do have some other options. As Mack mentioned, there's a lot of data that can be given to them about the number of commercial properties and how important a stable community is to the economy of that particular community. So they need to be able to access that so that they can go to market and spend their money. So it does have a financial impact and revenue impact to those communities. And if you hit them with facts, they tend to listen a lot more. Also, police chiefs are appointed individuals. They typically work for a city manager or mayor. Perhaps they're talking to the wrong leaders. So you have some other options to look at to try to engage them and allow them to have that. Having a volunteer program is just the best of both worlds, because you don't have to have a law enforcement officer to do this. The volunteers can do that in partnership with the law enforcement agency. It's just the perfect solution. So why a leader would not welcome that opportunity, I just can't wrap my head around that.
And I will say too that it's okay to start small. You know, just because, you know, we started with 25 volunteers doesn't mean that you can't start out with 10 volunteers. Mm-hmm. You know, so don't be afraid to just start somewhere.
Some may be concerned about the liability that may be that government entity may absorb with that, and the statute already addresses that. It says there is no liability to the government entity that has that.
From our perspective, if you really want this program in your community, if you're an advocate in your community and you want this program, first thing to do is get involved. Get involved in a positive and proactive way. Download the Parking Mobility app. That will immediately start collecting data in your community. Encouraging others to do the same thing will help us to reach the thresholds that we set. So every community has a demographic, number of people, a lot of numbers describe our communities. And once our communities reach a certain threshold, we'll actually reach out to people who've helped us to collect that data and help to organize them, help them advocate for the program in their community, talk to those correct decision makers, and do it in a way that helps them overcome their fears. A lot of those fears are the liability that they may face. They're concerned about confrontation. They're concerned about vigilantism. They're concerned about a lot of issues, and we can overcome those fears, but we have to have numbers first to start those conversations.
This is a question for any of you. We get many calls at our office that express misunderstanding of what the law is. Some examples are law enforcement is not allowed to go on private property to enforce disabled parking laws, or law enforcement can't go to apartment complexes, or the owners of the property have told law enforcement not to enforce the parking laws there. So can you address some, what are some other common myths and misunderstandings you've heard in your efforts to enforce?
We have received several of those kind of comments that we don't have jurisdiction there, and they're quite mistaken. If the public has access to it, and they have disabled parking places that are regulated, they're in place for a purpose. Law enforcement has the authority to go on that property and enforce those statutes. It is not selective enforcement. It's not reserved parking for a president of a company or something like that. If it's a disabled place, it is reserved for a disabled person, period, end of discussion.
Are there unique challenges at apartment complexes, places like that?
We send if volunteers report to us that they're having issues, we'll reach out to those particular places with a uniform officer and educate them on how the disabled parking enforcement program works and what we're doing and how we're doing it.
If your deputies or volunteers go to a place of public accommodation or business and they notice that the parking spot itself is incorrectly striped or incorrectly marked, is missing signage, do you take any steps to educate the business about that, or do you refer them to the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation or some other entity?
Yes, that's exactly what I do, Ron. I do refer them to the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation, or I also tell them that they can contact 311, City of Austin code enforcement, because sometimes it depends as far as whether those parking spaces are striped, whether there's a ramp, those kinds of things depends on who actually has jurisdiction over the property. So I will give them those two resources.
As law enforcement, we don't have any jurisdiction when it comes to that.
One of the things that we as advocates are pretty frustrated by, and one of the things that we're collecting a lot of data on across the state is on improperly marked spaces. So TDLR, Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation, is responsible for enforcement of that. However, they have a very small enforcement staff. They only at this time enforce these standards on new construction. So there's no review of old construction. Obviously, there are lots of opportunities. We had a health club that their patrons were getting citations for parking illegally in accessible parking spaces. Yes, I said at a health club. They didn't want to walk too far to go work out. But they recognized that if the signs weren't there, that they couldn't get a ticket. So they removed the signs. And TDLR couldn't do anything because it wasn't new construction and they just don't have the staff to do it. We'd love to get to a point where we can engage citizen volunteerism across the state to help with that type of enforcement and education. And it's an easy fix. I think it's something that can be done. We just need to get TDLR on board with that, and we need to get the legislature to understand that this is an issue that's facing Texans with disabilities everywhere in our communities. It's a way to provide some revenue for communities in the short term. That should never be the driving force behind it, but we can utilize that revenue to really affect some really positive accessibility change across Texas. And this is a way that we can use data and the power of the disability community to affect that change.
I want to thank you all. We're out of time. We had a couple more questions I might get with you afterwards so we can respond by email. But thank you, every one of you, for being here today and giving us your time. Ron, thank you for joining us as well. And I want to thank everyone else in attendance for joining us today. If you have additional questions, please forward them to me at gcpd@gov.texas.gov. and we will make sure and get those answered for you. We will send the presentation materials to you later on today or tomorrow. Thank you for joining us again. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Great job, guys.
Thank you very much.